They aren't really made like this anymore. These movies come from different countries and styles, but they share a common instinct, using fantasy to explore obsession, fear, desire, and discomfort without offering easy explanations. As usual, feel free to add your own picks in the comments. And let's get started. Valerie and Her Week of Wonders is one of the most enigmatic films of the Czechoslovak New Wave. The film follows a young girl named Valerie as she moves toward womanhood, exploring the loss of innocence through a series of confusing, bizarre, horrific, and deeply surreal experiences. The story is adapted from a novel written in the 1930s during the height of Czech surrealism, and that background matters. The film doesn't follow logic so much as it follows associations, symbols, and shifting meanings. Religion hangs over everything. Catholic guilt, rituals, and hypocrisy shape the atmosphere. A predatory priest looms over Valerie, wrapping her in his dark cloak and feeling like a shadow of death. Valerie's grandmother becomes a ghostly, vampiric figure, obsessed with lost youth, feeding on Valerie's vitality while scolding her for growing up. It is dark and uncomfortable, but it's also hypnotic, constantly shifting its meanings and inviting interpretations that never fully settle. Fellini Satyricon is one of Federico Fellini's most fantastical films. Loosely based on the ancient novel by Petronius, it follows the wanderings of Encolpius, a scholar played by Martin Potter, as he drifts through a series of disturbing and often sexual encounters. The structure is deliberately loose, offering impressions rather than a tightly connected narrative. Satyricon is set in ancient Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero, but this is not a familiar historical reconstruction. Fellini presents the city as a surreal, dreamlike space, stripped of grandeur and order. Instead of discipline and power, everything appears driven by appetite and desire. The film's overt sexuality was controversial at the time of its release. And while it may not be considered Fellini's most important work, Satyricon remains one of his most distinctive, defined by its atmosphere, strangeness, and boldness. Jabberwocky is a dark medieval fantasy inspired by Lewis Carroll's nonsense poem of the same name. It was the first feature film directed solely by Terry Gilliam, and it follows the misadventures of Dennis Cooper, played by Michael Palin. Dennis is a young peasant, the son of a barrel maker who leaves home to seek his fortune in the city, only to stumble into a world of misery, bad luck, and a monstrous creature that terrorizes the kingdom. The film takes place in a grim, muddy version of the Middle Ages, where nearly everyone is corrupt, filthy, or foolish. Despite that bleak setting, Jabberwocky plays out as a twisted fairy tale, filled with absurd situations and deliberately grotesque characters. It stands out for its strange mix of cruelty and humor, remaining a warm, chaotic, and unmistakably Gilliam-style piece of cult fantasy that may not be polished or refined. Heavy Metal is a sci-fi fantasy cult classic, packed with gore, bad language, and plenty of nudity. The story plays out like a trip through space and time, all framed by the evil influence of a glowing green orb known as Loch Nar. The film is structured as an anthology and was adapted from the magazine of the same name. Its pulpy, deliberately sleazy tone was clearly part of the appeal, and multiple animation studios contributed to the final result. Some of the standout segments include Captain Stern, which turns a space station court case into complete chaos, and Harry Canyon, a film noir riff in which a tough taxi driver tries to survive a brutal couple of days involving gangsters, damsels in distress, and that same deadly green sphere. Excalibur was released in the early 1980s and became successful enough to spark a wave of sword and sorcery films that followed. It's fair to describe it as one of the most faithful cinematic interpretations of the Arthurian legend. Even with its now dated special effects, Excalibur's scale and ambition remain intact. Director John Boorman focuses on the myth itself, allowing the story's weight and atmosphere to carry the film rather than relying on spectacle alone. The cast was largely made up of actors who were not yet major stars, which helps keep the focus on the narrative. The story unfolds through the perspective of Merlin, played by Nicol Williamson, whose performance dominates many of the film's key moments. The result is a blend of drama, moments of dark humor, strong performances, and unusually graphic medieval battle scenes. The Company of Wolves is a werewolf film unlike most others, built as a gothic dreamscape inspired by fairy tales rather than traditional horror rules. The central character is Rosaline, played by Sarah Patterson, a modern variation on Red Riding Hood, and a reflection of the vulnerable female figures common in classic fairy tales. Through a dream, Rosaline finds herself living in an 18th century village, surrounded by forests filled with wolves and quiet threats. Rosaline's grandmother, played by Angela Lansbury, fills her head with warnings and cautionary tales about men and beasts, blurring the line between folklore and lived experience. Rather than following a standard werewolf narrative, The Company of Wolves layers its story as a dream framed by stories within the dream. The creatures themselves become part of a larger metaphor, and the focus shifts away from simple horror toward sexuality, danger, and control. The Lair of the White Worm is a strange and provocative horror fantasy directed by Ken Russell. Made before either actor became widely known, the film stars Hugh Grant and Peter Capaldi in an unlikely genre setting that feels deliberately offbeat from the start. Loosely adapted from Bram Stoker's novel of the same name, the story centers on the ancient legend of the Dampton worm. When an archaeology student, played by Capaldi, uncovers what appears to be the skull of a giant serpent, he begins linking the discovery to the old local myth. Hugh Grant plays James Dampton, a descendant of the man said to have defeated the creature centuries earlier. As the story unfolds, the film moves through missing persons, local legends, and ritualistic imagery, building toward a figure who embodies the film's threat. Amanda Donahoe's Lady Sylvia is a seductive and predatory presence, blending serpent mythology with classic vampire traits. The result is a visually wild, sexually charged fantasy that mixes folklore, horror, and excess, very much in line with Ken Russell's taste for provocation.